When you look at a map, it's easy to just see lines. But what if I told you some of those lines represent decades of protest, of passion, of people fighting for an identity? Well, today, we're going to explore the story behind one of those very lines, the one that created India's 29th state, Telangana.
So on this day, June 2nd, 2014, there were huge celebrations as Telangana finally, officially appeared on the map. But here's the thing. This moment wasn't really a beginning. It was actually the end, the final chapter of a story that stretched back for generations. So what on earth could drive a fight that lasted for so long?
Well, it really boils down to this incredibly powerful, simple slogan, Nilu, Nidalu, Niyamakalu, which means water, funds, and jobs. These three fundamental things were at the absolute heart of the conflict, and they are the key to understanding everything that happened next.
To really get a grip on this, we've got to go way back, all the way back to 1956, when two very different regions were kind of mashed together to form a single state.
So before 56, you had the old princely state of Hyderabad, which was ruled by the Nizam, and the part of it that spoke Telugu was known as Telangana. That region was then merged with the existing Andhra state, creating this new, much larger state called Andhra Pradesh. Now, on paper, you can see the logic, right? Let's unite everyone who speaks the same language. But in reality, this was a union of two completely different worlds.
And the differences ran deep. Geographically, Telangana is a pretty dry plateau, totally dependent on rain-fed tanks and wells. You compare that to the Andhra region with its super fertile river deltas and sophisticated canal systems. Culturally, Telanga's traditions were this unique mix with heavy influences from Urdu and Marathi. That was a world away from the more Sanskrit-influenced culture of the coast. And they even had completely different modern histories. One was under a princely ruler, the other under direct British rule. This wasn't just a merger, it was a culture clash from day one.
Now, the leaders back then, they knew this merger was a bit risky. So, to try and calm the fears of the people in Telangana, they made a whole series of promises. And this agreement, this pact, would become the spark for decades of anger. This was what they called the gentleman's agreement, basically a safety net. It promised that any extra money made in Telangana would be spent on Telangana. It guaranteed that local people would get first dibs on local jobs and in colleges. And it even made sure they'd get a share of political power. It was a promise of fairness, a promise of protection.
So, that was a big question, wasn't it? The one that was about to ignite a firestorm. The ink was barely dry on this agreement when people started saying it was being broken.
And what was the result? Well, just a little over a decade after the merger, the whole region just erupted. Students from Osmania University started this massive movement, and pretty soon, protests and strikes were absolutely everywhere in Telangana.
And their complaints? They were a direct echo of the promises that had been made. Protesters were saying that Telangana's extra money was being spent elsewhere, and that outsiders were taking all the good government jobs. Those Mulki rules, the very ones meant to protect local jobs, were just being ignored. And that so-called Regional Council for Protection turned out it had no real power. It felt like every single safeguard had failed. The human cost was just devastating. This wasn't some minor protest. According to the official records, 370 people, most of them students, were killed in the police response. A whole generation was scarred by this, but the demand for justice, it only got stronger.
So after that huge 1969 movement was suppressed, things got quiet for a while. But underneath that calm surface, the differences between the regions didn't just continue, they got worse. They became measurable and totally impossible to ignore. Let's start with the most critical resource of all, water. By 2007, the disparity was just stark. The Andhra region had 13 lakh hectares irrigated by big canal projects. In Telangana, that number was only 2.5 lakh. So what did that mean? It meant Telangana farmers were forced to rely on wells, digging deeper and deeper as the groundwater just disappeared. And this gap, it stretched into education too. By the 2000s, the Andhra region had 181 colleges. Telangana had just 159. And that's even with the state capital Hyderabad being there. For the young people of Telangana, this wasn't just some statistic. It meant fewer opportunities, and it felt like their future was just being ignored. The human cost of all these systemic problems was just tragic. Get this, in a period of just 18 months, almost 2/3, 63% of all farmer suicides in the entire state happened in the Telangana region.
This shocking number became a symbol of the deep, deep despair that had taken hold.
And this quote, it just perfectly captures how people felt. When a commission asked a student leader if Telangana could actually survive on its own, this was his reply. It really tells you everything you need to know about the sense of alienation and the desperate, desperate desire for self-rule. So, by the time we hit the turn of the century, the movement entered its final and most decisive phase. But this wasn't just a repeat of 1969. Oh no. It evolved into one of the most creative and widespread people's movements in modern Indian history.
The movement became famous for its really unique forms of protest. Take Vantavarpu. This is where entire communities would just come out, set up kitchens right in the middle of major highways, and share a meal. It was peaceful, it was powerful, and it was brilliantly disruptive. It sent a very clear message. These roads, these public spaces, they belong to us.
And it wasn't just that. You had doom-doms, these huge cultural gatherings that used song and dance to tell the story of their struggle. You had massive rallies called Garjanas that drew hundreds of thousands of people. And, crucially, these joint action committees or JACs were formed, and they united everyone, students, lawyers, government workers, artists, all under one banner for one single cause.
With this incredible, non-stop pressure coming from the ground up, the political wheels in Delhi finally started to turn. The decades of struggle were about to pay off.
So the final push really started in the late 90s. A huge moment came in 2001 when the TRS party was formed with just one single goal: get statehood. Then the massive people's movement in 2009 just made the demand impossible for the central government to ignore any longer. And all of that led to February 2014, when the bill to create the state was finally passed. The dream was real.
And so, that brings us right back to where we started, to a new line on the map of India. A line that represents the hopes, the sacrifices, and the incredible persistence of millions of people over 60 very long years.
You know, forming the state was the end of one struggle, but it was really the beginning of another one. The goal, remember, was always to secure those three things: water, funds, and employment. So the question now is, a decade on, how well has that promise actually been fulfilled? Maybe the real work has only just begun.